Bright Cutie. Every student matters.
Once again, hello students, and I'm with chapter number 10, The End of Bipolarity. And in this chapter, we are going to do the causes of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, post Cold War era emergence of new states, shock therapy in Russia, and relevance of non aligned moment. The end of the bipolar world, it was from 1989 to 1991, and this flag shows USSR and this shows US. Russian Revolution occurred in 1917 and the people were against to capitalist and were in favor of adopt socialism. It is called Soviet system. USSR formally established in 1922 and leader Lenin has 15 subnational Soviets and one party rule that was Communist Party, and the features were like Soviet economy experienced complex communication network. It has vast energy resources like oil, iron and steel, and good transport sector to connect to remote areas. And Soviet Union industries produced every domestic product from pin to cars. And quality might not match with that of the West technology. Soviet Union provides basic necessities including health, education, childcare, and other welfare schemes at very less cost. And there was no employment in Soviet Union, and land and productive assets were owned by the state only. Now there were few causes of disintegration of Soviet Union. As let's start with this like Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had total 15 republics before its disintegration in 1991, and Russia was one of the republics, and here is the list of the members: Armenia, Belarus, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Lithuania, Russia, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Estonia, Kazakhstan, Latvia, Moldova, Tajikistan, and Ukraine. The Socialist Bloc or Second World War. USSR not equal to Socialist Bloc. Not to be confused with USSR, these are East European countries which showed allegiance to USSR in socialist or communist principles. And USSR was the leader of Socialist Bloc. So Socialist Bloc is the superset and USSR is the subset. To make it simple, most of these countries were under fascist rule during Second World War. And when USSR liberated them, they came under USSR control, and Warsaw Pact was a military alliance which kept the socialist group together. And remember, NATO, the military alliance for capitalist countries. Soviet system USSR 1917, the ideals of socialism and the need for an egalitarian society, the biggest attempt to abolish private property, primacy to the state and the institution of party. Soviet system centered around the Communist Party and no opposition was allowed, and the economy was planned and controlled by the state. There were few problems with USSR: the bureaucratic and authoritarian system, lack of democracy, lack of freedom of speech, one party system that is communist, and unaccountability to the people also, dominance of Russia, neglect of the interest of other republics, high expenditure on defense, low on infrastructure and technology. I tell you, like USSR was becoming superpower day by day, and they had an authoritarian system. Like they thought democracy is not good, but they believed in dictatorship, and people were not allowed to say anything. So it was lack of freedom as well. And the Communist Party system was not accountable to the people. They were not answerable. Whatsoever decisions were taken, they were not answerable to the people. And it was the dominance of Russia that they were neglecting the results of the interests of the other republics, and they were just pressurizing and forcefully giving their decisions to those republics. And there was a high expenditure on defense rather than the technology or on the development of the republics. And it was low on infrastructure and technology. So people were now feeling suffocated. Disintegration of the USSR, there were few major events like crisis in socialist bloc. People in many East European countries started protest against their own government in USSR. Without the right intervention from USSR at the right time, communist governments in the Second World War collapsed and one after the other. and the fall of Berlin Wall. That is, Germany was divided after the Second World War among the socialist USSR and the capitalist Western regimes, and the fall of Berlin led to the series of events including the disintegration of USSR. Economic and political reforms in USSR. Gorbachev identified the economic and political problems of USSR and started a series of reforms. With the intention to revive economy, this was a deviation from the communist policies and was more closely associated with the market economy, and many communist leaders in USSR opposed reform initiated by Gorbachev. They encouraged a coup in 1991. We will read about all these in details. The coup of 1991 and opposition against this coup, Boris Yeltsin, who won popular election in Russian Republic, protested against the coup and the central control of USSR, and freedom for republics became the slogan, and Boris Yeltsin and the pluralist movement advocated democratization and rapid economic reforms, while the hardline communist elite wanted to thwart Gorbachev's reform agenda, and power shift from Soviet center to republics, and republics like Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus emerged powerful. They declared that the Soviet Union was disbanded. Let's move to the questions now. Highlight any one major distinction between the Soviet economy and the capitalist economy. The Soviet economy was planned and controlled by the state only, whereas the capitalist economy was enjoyed by the people or group of the people as well as by the state. And why did the one party system represented by the Communist Party become a source of dissent and dissatisfaction among the Soviet people? Reasons were lack of democracy and absence of freedom of speech, and the Soviet system became bureaucratic and authoritarian. And strict control over all the institutions and technology became outdated and productivity reduced. Three features that distinguish the Soviet economy from that of the capitalist country like the US. The economy was based on the ideals of socialism. There was no place for the institution of private property under the Soviet economy, and the state ownership was the dominant form, and land and private assets were owned and controlled by the Soviet state. Complete the sentences. The Berlin Wall symbolized the division between the capitalist and the communist world. And we have to correct this statement. It is Mikhail Gorbachev. The Soviet Union had become stagnant in an administrative and political sense, as well as Mikhail Gorbachev promised to reform the economy, catch up with the West, and loosen the administrative system. That is, match the column. And then what was the ideology on which Soviet system was based on? It was socialist. And when the socialist Soviet came into existence, that is revolution of 1970. Eastern European countries, the Soviet Union after the Second World War. Now, what exactly the Soviet system is, let's do it in brief and detail as well. The Soviet economy became more powerful and developed than the rest of the world except than that of USA, because both were competitors as well. The difference was their ideologies, but yes, of course, both were superpowers. But Soviet system has complex communication network, vast energy resources like oil, iron, steel, machinery production, and transport sector. Domestic production that manufactured everything from cars to pens, and Soviet Union had minimum standard of living for all citizens, including health care, education, children care, and other welfare schemes. The Soviet system in the 1970s, it became bureaucratic and authoritarian, making life very difficult for its citizens, and lack of democracy and freedom of expression. And one party system had tight control over the institution, and it was unaccountable to the people. When there is a dictatorship, when you don't have your fundamental rights to use, you cannot enjoy your freedom. At that time, it is very suffocating. Everything is like pressurized atmosphere. And second thing, everything was done forcefully. And though government was not even accountable to people. So what was the role of the citizens then when everything was in the hands of the government only? So now people wanted some change, and Russia dominated everything, and other regions felt neglected and suppressed. And in arm races also, the Soviet Union managed to match the US from the time to time, but at a great cost. In 1970, Soviet system lagged behind the West in technology, infrastructure, and most importantly, in fulfilling the political and economic aspirations of the citizen. See, each citizen has some desire. He or she should feel belongingness to the country, which was lacking in Soviet system. And instead of expanding the technology, the infrastructure, the political and economic desires of people, they were more focused on only and only in military level. So the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 79 weakened the system even further. Though wages continued to grow and productivity and technology fell considerably behind the West. Why? Because the Soviet system was only concerned about the military aspects. And this led to consumer shortages, food imports increased every year, and the Soviet economy was flattering and slowly became stagnant in the 1970s. Mikhail Gorbachev, who became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1985, he sought to reform the systems. And after his arrival, there were certain reforms, and people at least got the freedom of speech. And reforms were necessary to keep the USSR abreast of the information and technological revolutions taking place in the West, because they were lagging behind in information and technology. His decision to democratize and reform the Soviet Union had other effects. And East European countries started to protest against their own governments and the Soviet Union. Gorbachev did not intervene when the disturbances occurred and the communist regimes collapsed one after another. These developments were accompanied by a crisis that escalated within the USSR that hastened its disintegration. Gorbachev initiated the economic political reforms and democratization with the country. And these reforms were opposed by leaders with the Communist Party. And a coup took place in 1991 that was encouraged by Communist Party hardliners. And the people had tasted freedom by then and did not want to old communist rule. Because when you give freedom to somebody, at that time you would feel very energetic, harmonious atmosphere, and the peace develops at that time. And when you are in like when you have tasted that freedom, you will not go back to the communist rule or the dictatorship, or you don't want to live a forceful life. That is what was happening in USSR as well. Like Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, and Putin, they emerged as national hero in opposing the coup. The Russian Republic began to shake off the centralized control, and power began to shift from the Soviet center to the East European part of the Soviet Union. In December 1991, the leadership of Yeltsin, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, three major republics under the USSR, declared that the Soviet Union was disbanded, and capitalism and democracy was adopted as a basis or post-Soviet republics. Because capitalism gives you a development in your information and technology. It expands your economy. It expands your industrialization, and above all, if democracy is also there, so that means people have the interference in the government's decisions. So when both the things go simultaneously, like parallel, at that time there are more chances of the development of the country. Now, the formation of Commonwealth of Independent States, 1991, Russia was now the successor of Soviet Union, and it inherited the seat in the United Nations Security Council. Russia accepted all international treaties and commitments of the Soviet Union, and it took over as the only nuclear state and carried out some nuclear disarmament treaties. But there were certain factors which led to the disintegration of the USSR economic weakness. Let's do it in detail now. The weakness of the economy was a major cause of dissatisfaction among the people in USSR. There was a severe shortage of consumer items. The reason for economic weakness were the following: huge military spending, maintenance of satellite states in Eastern Europe, and maintenance of the Central Asian republics within the USSR. Now, what happened? Like USSR, just for its supremacy, it spent a lot on the military spending only, and it maintained satellite states in Eastern Europe and the Central Asian republics and within the USSR, because they did not want to lose that track which they won as a superpower. But instead, like initially it was a superpower, but internally it was getting weakened day by day. And when the economy is weak, at that time it becomes very difficult for a country to rise up. Then political unaccountability. The Communist Party regime's single party rule for around 70 years turned authoritarian, and it's a pretty long time. There was widespread corruption, nepotism, and lack of transparency. When there is a government which is full of corruption, nepotism, and lack of transparency, then there are very less chances for common people to be part of that regime. And the single party rule itself means that it was kind of dictatorship. There was no role of any other party, there was no role of any citizen of the country, and people didn't even have the choices. So for 70 years, they were having that power, that they were using the authority, and people were not happy with this system. When Gorbachev's arrival was there, his decision to allow elections with a multi party system and create a presidency for the Soviet Union, it began a slow process of democratization that eventually destabilized and communist control and contributed to the collapse of Soviet Union. Gorbachev's reforms, once people started to enjoy freedom under Mikhail Gorbachev reforms, they demanded more. Because, as I said, when you taste the freedom, you want it more and more and more. If you have to eat chapati only one day and on the next day you get some non-veg or some good vegetables with it, so you will stay with those menu only, like which you tasted apart from only chapati. So what does it mean? Now the people were demanding in big force, and it was difficult to control also, and the people wanted to catch up with the West quickly. Now there was a rise of nationalism. Rise of nationalism among countries like Russia, Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Georgia, etc. is the most important and immediate cause of disintegration of the USSR. And the national feeling was strong among the more prosperous area in USSR, not in Central Asian republics. And ordinary people among prosperous republics did not like to pay big price to uplift the backward Central Asian republics. Okay, let's highlight the three positive and three negative features each of Soviet system in the Soviet Union, or otherwise three features of Soviet system. Positive are Soviet system was more developed than the rest of the world except USA. Minimum standard of living was ensured for all the citizens, and the government subsidized the basic needs including health, education, etc. And this is a good thing. If these things are subsidized in a country, people can live very easily, and there was no unemployment. And but the negative features were bureaucratic and authoritarian, lack of democracy, absence of freedom, and only one party system, and the party did not recognize the aspirations and the feelings of people of the country. What changes took place in Soviet system with the passage of time? Bureaucratic and authoritarian, and for 70 years they ruled the republic. And those republic felt that they had paid a high cost by merging and connecting backward region to Soviet Union was the reason of dissatisfaction in prosperous European republic. One major distinction between the Soviet economy and the capitalist economy: the Soviet economy was planned and controlled by the state only, whereas the capitalist economy was enjoyed by the people or group of people as well as by the USSR. Why did the Soviet Union disintegrate? Let's do the briefing and the detailing. Internal weakness of the system, political and economic, and failed to meet the aspiration of the people, and economic stagnation. And the resources used to maintain nuclear arsenal and the military state and maintain its satellite state in Eastern Europe. Huge economic burden country could not cope with, and they could see the disparities in the West. Now what was happening? People were comparing themselves with the Western culture and the Western things, and they had huge burden of country which they were not ready to do so, and there were many differences with the West as well. Now they wanted to compete, they just wanted to come forward as the West was, and after years the reality came as a political and psychological shock, and the Soviet had become stagnant in administrative and political sense as well. Now, the communist part that ruled the Soviet Union for over 70 years was not accountable to the people, and the people were not accepting this thing. They had objection. Now, the people were asking the questions, and it was objectionable that why they were not accountable. And ordinary people were alienated by the slow administration and rampant corruption. Party bureaucrats gained more privileges than the ordinary people. Gorbachev's reforms were slow and did not benefit the people. He changed many things. He gave them the freedom. He gave them the freedom of the speech as well. But it did not benefited the people. Members of Communist Party were of the opposite view, and because their powers were eroding, so Gorbachev's reforms didn't work very much. In this tug of war, one side was Gorbachev and one side was Communist Party, and it lost support on all sides and divided public opinion. Because obviously the Communist Party was ruling for 70 years, so half of the people were in their support also. So even those who were with him were also disillusioned with his policies that he did not defend them. The rise of nationalism and the ideas of sovereignty within countries like Russia, Baltic republics, and Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Ukraine, Georgia have been the immediate cause of the disintegration of USSR. And the national dissatisfaction with the Soviet Union was strongest in the European and prosperous part of Russia. Let's move to the consequences of disintegration. End of Cold War, changes in world politics, emergence of new countries, superiority of democracy and capitalist system. End of Cold War was obviously there because they were not rising up in IT, and they signed so many treaties as well. So they were bound not to have this Cold War anymore. And then changes in world politics was like now the socialist republics were also moving forward toward the democratization and emergence of new countries also. They did not want any kind of supremacy now, and the democracy was a superior one, and people wanted capitalist system because they wanted to rise up in the terms of development more and more. The end of thousand year reich, that means you could see in the pictures how the USSR was disintegrating. The demise of the Soviet Union left the US as the world's sole superpower. Without the danger of a superpower confrontation, the US was now more free to use its military power. Because as you all know, United States has the ideology of capitalism and democracy. And now the republics, those who were in the favor of socialists, they were moving towards the ideology of US. Additionally, new opportunities for cooperative international efforts would become possible without the bipolar competition. This new dynamic would be tested when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. End of the Cold War confrontation and end of arm race and a possible new peace, and power relations changed and influence of ideas and institutions also changed. Unipolar system due to the end of Cold War tensions. And you know why it was all happening? Because US was superpower, but it was more into capitalism. So it was just developing its relation with the other countries in terms of business and economy, where USSR was not thinking at that time. That is why it collapsed. Multipolar system gave a new scope for international relations. US became the sole superpower, and backed by US, the capitalist ideology was now the dominant economic system internationally. World Bank and IMF became powerful advisors to all these countries to transform their economies to capitalism. And politically, democracy became the best way to organize political life. Because without economy, nothing is possible. And now people were focusing, like people in the sense, the other countries and rest of the world apart from USSR, all were concentrating on the economic system of their countries. They wanted to be democratic and capitalist. As India is a blend of both the ideologies, but India is more focused on capitalism also, because due to the dense population of our country, we want to remove those challenges which are still moving around in the country, like poverty, uneducation, and unemployment. And democracy and capitalism give us more chances to grow more in this field. The end of the Soviet bloc meant the emergence of new countries. Obviously, when this bloc was ended, so the emergence of new countries was actually expected, and all these countries had their independent aspirations and choices. The problem started there and then only, because now these independent aspirations were democracy, and they wanted capitalist country. So now they were more into like industrialization. Some of them, especially the Baltic and Eastern European states, wanted to join the European Union and become part of the NATO, because now they were more focused on capitalist infrastructure. And the Central Asian countries wanted to take advantage of their close ties with Russia and established ties in the West and US, China, and others. Now, the formation of Russia. Russia accepted successor state of Soviet Union and inherited Soviet seat in the United Nations Security Council and accepted all international treaties and commitments of Soviet Union. It took over as only nuclear state of the post-Soviet state and carried nuclear disarmament measures with US and Soviet Union dead and buried. Many new states were also formed. The Baltic Republic of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, as we already told you, you were the first to declare their independence in December 1991. And the Soviet republics of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus also cancelled the 1922 treaty that led to the formation of USSR. The other republics to declare their independence were Georgia, Armenia, and Moldova. And all these countries had their own national aspirations. They therefore became members of the United Nations. And this led to an increase in the number of members of this world body. And these new states had apprehension that Russia might again occupy and seize control of them. Therefore, they found it to be the interest to join NATO, that is North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the Central Asian countries such as Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan took a Middle East course, and in addition to establishing good relations with USA and the Western nations, they contributed to have close relationship with Russia also. They did not want to spoil the relation with either of the blocs. The Central Asian countries such as Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan took a middle course, and in addition to establishing good relations with USA and Western nations, they continued to have close relationship with Russia also. Czechoslovakia also saw the end of Soviet dominion in 1992. The Czechoslovak Republic was dissolved, and two independent republics of Czech and Slovakia was born on 1st January 1993. In 1990, war out in Yugoslavia, the racial and religious conflicts presented a horrible scenario. And Yugoslavia's various provinces like Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia declared their independence. And consequently, in 1991, the United Nations Organization terminated Yugoslavia's membership and directed the various regions to apply afresh for United Nations membership. In 2003, the country called Yugoslavia ceased to exist. In its place, a new federation called Serbia and Montenegro and emerged in 2006. Montenegro succeeded from Serbia, and the two independent states came into being, one called Serbia and other called Montenegro. After the disintegration of Soviet Union, Russia's region of Chechnya and Dagestan also faced terrible situation. In Chechnya, the civil war had started in the year 1994, and Russian forces bombarded guerrilla-controlled areas. Russia had to face conflict in Dagestan also, but the government effectively suppressed the revolt in that region. And in brief, I would say that after the Soviet Union's disintegration, many new players came on international stage with their own political and economic interest. Therefore, there still existed various kinds of uncertainties concerning the New World Order.